Okay, well, why do you start laughing the second it goes live?
Because all three of us were sitting there
Watching it. Well, we're waiting for because it takes forever, right? You
takes a
click the
little,
button and it's just like, is it time to speak yet? Is it time to speak yet? And then finally it's time to speak, and you're like, I don't have a thing to say. And then Carl starts laughing at me.
But both of you guys were also in the little corner, in the little box there on the, and just looking straight ahead, like, okay, are we ready? Very serious looking. When we had just been joking 2 seconds earlier.
Well, I mean, this is how we turn it on and off, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But Sarah's in Australia, and she's got lizards on the wall behind her, which I thought were giant spiders for a second, because I'm just convinced that that's it for Australia. It's just spiders everywhere. You know, there's no moving escalators at the airport. You just jump in. It's just a herd of spiders that move in.
You know, at least 50% are going to kill you.
Right, yeah. It's basically it. Everything in Australia tries to kill you. Even like the cute stuff tries to kill you.
Yes.
There's even the ugly stuff like Steve Faulkner will try to kill you. Okay, well, on that note, why don't we just hand it over to Sarah and let her do her thing?
Get you out of hot water.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go to bed. Okay. All right, have at it, Sarah.
Must be a lag. You ready? Can you hear us?
I don't know. She died? She disappeared?
Sorry. Yep, I'm back. Slight technical
She
hitch,
muted
but
you,
I'm
Bill.
back.
She didn't want to hear what you had to say.
Oh
boy.
Yeah, look what she did to you.
Wow, I have a really trippy screen here.
That's pretty cool.
Can you see it? It's like...
It's pretty awesome.
Okay, right. I don't know. Can you see my slides now?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, great. Well, we'll leave the trippy screen alone. No idea what was happening there.
It's okay.
So, fantastic. Thank you very much. It's my first ID24, so I'm pretty excited to be joining everyone. Today I wanted to talk about some lessons learned from building accessible complex web apps. So a little bit about me. I work for an organisation called Intopia that myself and a few others founded at the start of the year. We're a digital consultancy, and we've sort of been all working in the space for, you know, upwards of six odd years, and as part of that we have come across and have helped quite a few organizations to build some accessible complex web apps, and we all sort of have each other on speed dial, whether it's to talk to each other and bounce off ideas, or ask someone if they've come across a similar problem, or sometimes it's just to sort of lament about how difficult it can be to sort of build these complex web apps and single page apps. And so over time we've sort of developed this list of things that we think have worked really well for us, or alternately things that we would do differently in our next project. So we wanted to actually share those lessons with you. This is not a techie presentation, so I'm not going to be showing code samples or anything like that, but it's more about the some of the tips for how to do things, how to put together things, what team structure and expectation that you need. So predominantly the lessons that we've learned have come from two projects that we have worked on. The first one is a project that my colleague Adam has worked on, and he was the accessibility SME, subject matter expert, embedded into the team. And I guess this project is what I'd call the accessibility unicorn, the project that pretty much everyone would love to work on, because it's sort of doing the whole accessibility best practice. It's doing it in a great way, and the organisation really believes in what they're doing, and that they want to create an inclusive and delightful experience. So that project was actually an e-commerce web app built using Angular. Accessibility was built in from the start. And for this project, alongside, all the rest of the stuff that goes along with accessible design and development, there were also multiple rounds of usability testing, in addition to certain people with disabilities and other access requirements being included in the closed beta testing. So that's why I call it the accessibility unicorn, because I think that's it's hitting some of those points that we all want to work in. The second one, which is one that I and another colleague worked on, was a financial services web app. It was built in Polymer. This one wasn't so much of a unicorn because we were doing accessibility repair after the app had been built. It hadn't been released as yet, and I think they struggled to find someone that could help them with their accessibility up front. And as a consequence, the project sort of rolled on, and they brought me in sort of later on. So it was definitely more a repair job, and it had very stringent timelines. So we had what we called an accessibility MVP mark that we were hitting, which included conformance with WCAG level A, and also certain screen reader compatibility and technical testing. In both of these projects, we did have certain assistive technologies that we were testing with. So the e-commerce web platform was focusing on JAWS 17 and IE 11, and VoiceOver on iPad, because they were sort of focusing on the more desktop or tablet aspects of their web app. And for the financial services app, it was also desktop, but we tested and with JAWS 17 and IE 11, VoiceOver for Mac, and also NVDA and Firefox. And this will become apparent why I'm sort of outlining this right now, because one of the, I guess, the challenges and lessons we learned was about screen reader accessibility and compatibility, particularly in these complex web apps that are very heavily ARIA based. So the first lesson that we learned was, in order to set yourself up for success, you need to do so through research and planning. And I haven't talked about user research here, although that was done for that first project as accessibility was embedded in. But this was more research around the technologies themselves. So I don't think any of our, when we came into either of our projects, anyone had really looked at the accessibility of the framework that they were choosing, and finding out to what extent the chosen technology had considered or included accessibility in order to better estimate sort of resource and costs. So particularly with the Angular one, which sort of started off 2 years ago, I think it was kind of, this is new and shiny and we'd love to use it. And that was probably about as much of this decision that was made to use Angular. So as a result, in both projects, I think that the organizations didn't necessarily go into it with their eyes open around what the frameworks included as accessibility. And in particular, I guess the approach they took to accessibility. Later on, I'll speak more about, ARIA and the support and reliance on ARIA, but, just at a cursory glance, looking at, say, the Angular versus Polymer for very simple components, Polymer virtually relies all on ARIA. So simple example, buttons, instead of being a native HTML button, it's role equals button, tab index equals 0, yada, yada, yada. Angular for those sort of elements does rely a little bit more on the native HTML elements, and so there's sort of those types of considerations and decisions that can inform the technology that you choose, and the impact that is going to have both on your resourcing, your costs, but also on your users as well. So because these were, you know, sort of complex web apps, you'll notice when I was talking about sort of screen reader support, it was the latest screen reader. So we were supporting JAWS 17 for both of those projects. I think if I had my time over again and could sort of take the organization down this line, I'd probably ask for N-1, so maybe JAWS 16, just to give a little bit more of a spread of people with different screen readers and their versions. But you know, because we were doing complex web apps, we did actually rely on sort of the latest one. But in particular for the financial service app, the reason why we introduced NVDA into that test set was also because when I had outlined that, you know, the cost of JAWS, and that really, you know, we couldn't assume that everyone had the latest version of JAWS, and nor should we. They felt that NVDA as a free and open source screen reader might be a possible alternative, but taking into consideration that you know, someone may have been using JAWS all their life, so switching from one to another is not easy, but it at least gave an alternative. So tip 2 is probably nothing that is different to any application, complex or not, but becomes even more important when you're looking at complex apps, which is addressing accessibility from the beginning and clearly defining roles and responsibilities for each stage of the process. So in our accessibility unicorn, our e-commerce site, it was great to be able to embed accessibility at each stage of the process. So we had business analysts who were defining those requirements and very specifically defining what it is that the interface and the interaction should be, and having that accessibility SME embedded in the team meant that at each stage of the process there was that feedback, and also of course training up of a team. In that particular case, the team was fairly new to accessibility and Angular as well. So one of the interesting things was, I guess, it was an agile project, and at the start the velocity was quite slow, and this I think took the organisation a little bit by surprise. And you know, there had to be a bit of discussion and understanding that, you know, the sort of designers and particularly the developers on the team were not just learning one new technology, but also learning that technology and how to make it accessible. For the repair job though, for me in particular, process was just important. So we got into sort of a nice process and habit where and this was important because I was, along with my colleague, we sort of shared a full-time sort of 5-day role, but we were supporting a development team of about 10 people and about 3 testers as well. So we were very conscious about the fact that we could be the bottleneck, that we had to move really, really fast to in order to support and keep everything happening and to meet those MVP deadlines and also requirements. So for us, process was just as important, but like in a slightly different way. So the way we tackled this was there would be a piece of functionality that I would do a quick review, and everything was very agile and fast. And then I would sort of print out a copy of that feature and start marking it up with the changes that need to be made. Brief the developers and the testers as well, because the testers were going away and writing the acceptance criteria and test case. So it wasn't ideal. Acceptance criteria usually comes up front, but we were working, you know, as fast as we could. And you know, then the developers would actually you know, sort of repair that. They would work with me. There would be some pair programming at times, and then it would be passed over to me for a general QA. But then it actually went into, when a feature was actually delivered, it went to the formal QA test team that had been writing those test cases and actually executing those test cases. So for us, that process was extremely important, and knowing what everyone's role and responsibility, even that in that repair job, was critical for us to meet our MVP. Tip 3 comes particularly from my project in the financial services area, which was don't assume best practice will always be followed. Ask the questions, set expectations, and make sure everyone is on the same page. looking retrospectively, I probably wouldn't have necessarily noted that best practice wasn't being followed. And the example I'll give is that we had a mega menu with 3 levels of navigation, and when it came to repair, we started to repair it and found that actually the first level navigation was completely separate to second and third. So normally you would expect that second and third to be sort of children of the first, whether it be, you know, a list, you know, of sub items, you know, marked up. But it was actually 2 completely, you know, separate pieces of code with no relationship whatsoever, and that made the repair really, really difficult. And you know, to be honest, to this day, I'm still not entirely sure what the decision was in building the mega menu like that. So I wouldn't have necessarily, going into the project, thought to I guess specify or ask the questions about the technical architecture and what I would possibly consider is just best practice in building something like that. So I definitely think, you know, at that initial stage, asking those questions, setting those expectations, making sure everyone's on the same page and not necessarily assuming anything is going to be quite important. So the next lesson that I wanted to focus on was don't focus on WCAG to the exclusion of inclusive design. And again, I don't think this is anything that is, you know, different, but certainly what we found in complex web apps is that if you just focus on WCAG, you're not necessarily going to get a usable experience. This lesson is quite interesting from an Australian perspective. So I've been working with organisations through our national transition strategy, which is the government improving the accessibility of their websites and their content. And they did this through a strategy which had a whole lot in it about how to do it, how to review where you're at, you know, how to train up your staff. But what everyone ultimately focused on was that sites had to be level A compliant by the end of 2012 and level AA compliant by the end of 2014. And so instead of focusing on the user experience, there was a very, very heavy focus on WCAG and have I met it, and sort of a very tick or flick mentality. And you know, that doesn't necessarily lead to a good experience for everyone. So you can be technically compliant, but you may not be usable. I think Australia is maturing in that area. We're certainly seeing a lot more people talking about, inquiring about usability and usability testing with people with different access requirements. And that's just going to become more important with complex web applications in our view. So tip 1, a complex web app may not be usable if you consider accessibility to only be WCAG conformance. I think it's great that the recent W3C Way videos that have been released talk about notifications and notifying the user. And this is one area that you know, we in particular know that WCAG doesn't necessarily cover about that feedback. But if we weren't actually putting that feedback in when someone, say, you know, adds an item to a cart, then the user is left, you know, wondering what has happened. That leads, I guess, to the second thing, which is linked in with the first, which is tip 2 is to agree on the degree of user experience you and your team are aiming at to achieve upfront. And this is one of the things that is actually also clearly documented in the BS 8878 standard, the British standard around code of practice for accessibility. And they talk about the 3 different levels of accessibility and talking about and deciding what you're aiming for. Is it technical compliance, which is more that sort of WCAG type focused? Is it that something's usable? So, yep, I can do it, but, you know, I just need to get from A to B. I don't really care about the journey. And lastly, it's, you know, is it satisfying? So, you know, yes, I can get from A to B, but along that journey, you know, it's easy. I really love the way it's, you know, guiding me in the experience and that kind of thing. And from I guess a consultancy perspective, I think this is a really super important thing to talk about upfront, because often, clients, they know about accessibility, but it is often in the context of WCAG. And so by having those conversations, getting agreement and setting those expectations up front, I think you often, save yourself a lot of pain and hardship later on when people are, just focusing on WCAG and sort of challenging you about it. If everyone's on the same page, it's much, much easier to get that consensus and all be pulling in the same direction. Tip 3 is to understand the intent of each WCAG success criteria and how it shapes a user's overall experience. So when we're talking about complex apps, and in particular single page apps, sometimes you can still meet a success criterion, but perhaps the way you meet it, or its intent and its impact on the user experience can be slightly different. So a very simple example is page titles and updating page titles as pages transition and new content is displayed. Slightly different paradigm to a normal sort of page-to-page experience, but usually, for instance, when a user goes to a page, they will actually hear the page title read out to them via the screen reader. Now, I found that JAWS, if you insert a new page title, will actually do that, but some of the other screen readers don't. So in order to give users context of where they are, what do we do? Do we just say, oh well, we've added the page title, so we've met that particular criteria? Or is the intent of the criteria to be able to show people where they're at, that a page has been loaded, and give a title to that page? And how do we replicate that? And in our instance, it was often because we were in a single page app, once we had entered the app, it was sort of more setting focus into the main content area, or alternately, if it was being set at the top of the page, having a hidden heading that sort of served that same purpose as the page title, so a user still did know where they were in that first instance. Lesson 3. Supporting multiple screen readers when using ARIA can be a bitch. I think my whole team can testify to that, and know that there has been many a phone conversation, bitching about the different support by different screen readers for ARIA, and that's, to be honest, I'm not going to say it's not the fault of ARIA and it's not the fault of the screen readers. It's just something we have to live with, just like we have to live with cross-browser sort of issues. So, it's not taking away from the fact that it is going to be difficult. And I tell you, my project, after having sort of said, yes, let's support JAWS and VDA and VoiceOver, at some point, I just thought, why did you ever say that? Just maybe you just should have stuck with JAWS and VoiceOver. But anyway, we went down that path, and we continued down that path, and I've got no regrets. But yes, it was a rod for my own back at particular times. So tip 1, which is just a reiteration of what we can find in some of the ARIA documentation, is remember the first rule of ARIA use. If you can use a native HTML element or attribute, then do so. And this just comes from the fact that there's just so much better support and consistent support with screen readers for native HTML elements, and it can save a lot of heartache and pain to use those native elements, as opposed to be marking up with ARIA. I always have this analogy in mind with ARIA, because I do review a lot of sites, and I often see ARIA used, willy-nilly, and I always have this image in mind of a cowboy, and the cowboy rides into town, and over his back he's got a sack of ARIA, and he looks around and he sort of thinks, wow, this town, it needs a bit of ARIA. And so he starts taking out these ARIA attributes out of his sack, and he starts to go, oh look, the pharmacy over there. Gee, that would look great with an ARIA attribute. And so he pops an ARIA attribute over there, but sometimes he just gets a bit lazy and he just takes out, ARIA attributes and just throws them around the town. And then he goes, gee, that looks good. And he rides out and leaves the consequences for everyone else. And that's often what I feel about ARIA, is that, it's just people writing in, sprinkling a little bit of ARIA over it and thinking it's going to work, and then riding out of town and, sometimes leaving it for other people to mop up. So tip 2 was to really understand the parent-child relationships in ARIA. This was in particular, I guess, problematic, particularly for repair jobs where there was a lot of divs and spans and that kind of thing sort of injected into the content, which often meant that JAWS, which tends to be a little bit more forgiving on some of those things, worked fairly well, but often NVDA was quite strict about where you put things and what have you, and often there was a lot of work to actually repair the accessibility and to get that parent-child relationship right, so that all those screen readers were working sort of consistently or in the way that we wanted. Tip 3, don't leave screen reader testing till the end. Definitely test early and test often, just to make sure that you know where you're at, that you're not going down a path that ultimately doesn't give you the output that you want for a screen reader. I think it was great to all of the teams that we worked with, over time we were sort of showing them and training them up in screen reader testing. That's not to take away from, proper usability testing, but if we're looking at, what support there is, then it was an education process of, what is expected, what's the expected output with a screen reader, and allowing them to actually, learn and to take that on as they are developing, and then they could tap into us as needed. Tip 4 was to find or create code samples that follow best practice for baseline screen reader results. So what we found is that because there is different support for ARIA in different screen readers, that sometimes it was hard to tell whether it was our code or whether it was that screen readers didn't, support that particular attribute very well. So there are definitely resources out there for some of, I guess, the more simpler ARIA attributes. Certainly the Power Mapper ARIA test set or suite is really good for sort of baselining in that particular way. And there's a number of others that sort of were out there and could help. But often, if we were building the more complex web components, there were a lot of code samples that were available online, but not necessarily a lot of baseline testing to say, well, if you test with this particular screen reader and web browser combination, this is your expected output. So after sort of coming across this issue a few times, often we would ask the developers to sort of do a plain vanilla code sample outside of the application. And I say outside of the application because we did have some instances where when the code was within the app that was being built, we got one result from a screen reader, and when we just pulled it out and put that exact same code that was rendered into an HTML document, and it had a different output. So that sort of was quite important to say, okay, so where exactly, what's our baseline? If we had, if we could do this all over again, then where would we go from? Tip 5 is to create a decision tree for when an optimal solution across all screen readers cannot be reached. So there's, in my view, there was always going to be situations, and there was always situations where, just because of the different screen reader support, that we weren't always going to get an optimal solution. So when that was the case, how do we reach a decision on, say which screen reader or platform that we are going to prioritize over another? And when we did that, usually it was a combination of course, the impact to the user. So if we had 2 or 3, because sometimes there would be 2 or 3 sort of possible solutions where one solution would be slightly better for one screen reader over another, the next one, that might be reversed. We needed to have a clear, sort of idea of, first of all, what the impact for the user was. Then secondly, perhaps choosing maybe a primary screen reader. So in the eCommerce example with JAWS and VoiceOver on iPad, we often chose the JAWS solution over VoiceOver, so that people, that were looking at a desktop experience could have the best experience. It was also because VoiceOver has a lot more quirks, let's say, or bugs that couldn't necessarily be worked around. So ultimately, we probably could get a better, more inclusive experience on the JAWS desktop platform than VoiceOver on iPad. So when we need to make those decisions, it was sort of, we considered all of the different options, what the impact on the user was, and made those decisions appropriately. So tip number 6 is come to terms with the fact that sometimes you are just going to have to hack it to make it work. And I think that's possibly was more problematic or confronting for some of our devs who, liked perfectly clean code, and sometimes, we did have to hack it, or it was like, no, I'm sorry, this ARIA attribute is just not supported in the screen readers that we're using, so we need to go to a more old school, off-screen method than using an ARIA attribute. And sometimes I think that was a bit confronting for people, because they didn't want to have to hack it. They wanted something that was nice and clean and looked great. So I think that's just a setting of expectations and an education process. We never had anyone turn around and go, no, I'm not going to do that. But at the same time, I could see that it sometimes did bother developers, and could also look, particularly with my project and it being a very sort of tight timeline, there were things that I just had to compromise on. In particular, one of the issues we had was that often components had to be completely rebuilt or needed to be completely rebuilt in order to be accessible and to also work with all the different screen reader combinations that we were supporting. But the overhead of having to rewrite all of the unit tests, the non-accessibility unit tests associated with that, meant that we had to sort of come to an arrangement where it may not have been the optimal experience for this particular time round for MVP, but it allowed us to at least hopefully have a much more accessible experience, even if it wasn't optimal. So lesson 4, the need for usability testing only increases the more complex your app is. So tip 1 is to get usability testing into your project in any way you can. And we're totally down with bribery, using baked goods, chocolate, whatever it is that you need to do to get that usability testing in. As mentioned, I think Australia is on a journey in terms of maturity, and people are slowly coming to the realization that technical accessibility is not the same as usability, and accessibility is just a subset of great user experience. But it's often an education process. You do get organisations that are very, very stuck on the WCAG compliance, or that are unwilling or unable to support usability testing due to budgetary constraints. So it's always an interesting, line to, I guess, to step over when, we firmly believe that any testing should be done with both technical testing and the usability testing, but sometimes it's not possible. But certainly our experience was that, particularly in the e-commerce app, having so many rounds of usability testing. So in that particular app, there were 3 rounds of usability testing, plus, as I said, people included in the testing of the closed beta, meant that you got feedback early and often. When there are components that we felt may actually be problematic. So things like, menus, which we knew in the previous product had been a problem, and also tabs. As soon as they were ready to go, we started that usability testing so that we could refine that early, and also sort of embrace any feedback and design patterns into any of the other pages that were still being built. Tip 2 for usability testing, which is really just usability testing best practice, is selecting the right mix and number of users for usability testing. So in particular, the right mix was an interesting one for us in the e-commerce project, because although we wanted to test with a range of users, with a range of first of all, it was a range of different impairments, but of course, being a complex web app, we were also concerned about screen reader users, with it being a single page app and using ARIA. And, we struggled to find users that fit the criteria that weren't just power users of screen readers. And so I think after the first round of usability testing, where they were mostly power users, we made it very clear that the next set had to include users with sort of, either low to moderate proficiency with screen readers, to get that different mix and that different exposure to how they were experiencing that particular app. So sometimes, you do have to, I think, that often leads to having to build in more lead time for usability testing, particularly when you've got other requirements outside of those access requirements for recruitment. So, for the e-commerce, we were looking for people who were familiar with e-commerce platforms and what have you. And it's just not always easy to find people with that right mix. So, I guess definitely setting your expectations and setting those requirements, giving yourself more time for recruitment, or going out to a recruitment company or whoever's doing your usability testing earlier than perhaps that you think you need to. And then I guess, having a fallback position. So if you can't recruit that right mix of users, then what's the next best option? Tip 3 was testing with users as early and as often as you can. So definitely that iterative testing approach gives you that feedback early, helps you to shape, your design and development as you move forward, and not, get to the end and have to do complete redevelopment, which is sort of where the second project was at. Tip 4, listen to your users, but be careful about making generalizations. So for anyone who hasn't been, I guess, reading through, there's been quite a lot of discussion and articles around the use of tabs recently, starting out with Simply Accessible, and them talking about some of their testing and their experience of users using ARIA tabs with the new or the interaction model that follows more a software interaction, versus, I guess, what you'd call the old school approach, where you're more using links. You might be using screen reader text or off-screen text to note those links as tabs and what have you. There's then some follow-up feedback from articles, say on Medium, from Leone and Co. around their views on tabs, and about being careful about making generalizations. And I'll say hand on heart, for the commerce app, we actually went more down the Simply Accessible line. We had that exact same issue with the feedback for ARIA tabs of people not, not understanding what they are, not understanding the interaction model, and the choice was to go more old school in that particular sense. But irrespective of what the outcome is, listening to your users when usability testing is important, but also knowing that, you may choose to, I guess, not if it's one user's view, then perhaps it may not be representative, and how you can support users if you are looking at an interaction model that they might not be used to. So lesson 5 is to document any decisions or issues and feedback to the community. So for both projects, one of the things we were very clear on is making sure that we documented any decisions that we made. So when there were things that either weren't optimal or where we had to, say, choose one implementation over another, we clearly documented that. And one particular one of the projects was actually quite clear about the fact that when it goes live, they want to actually expose all that information, so not keep it hidden anywhere. But either way, it is important to have that so that at least internally the team knows that what the decisions were made, but also that it can be used, say, if there's someone who calls up who is having a problem, and that's clearly noted. But I think as as professionals, we also have an obligation to raise or submit any bugs that we find or improvements we've made to the vendors or creators of technology. So when we do come across assistive technology bugs, logging them to the relevant vendor, whether it be Freedom Scientific for JAWS, NV Access for NVDA, or so on and so forth, so that those can be raised and hopefully be actioned. As well as this, if you've got any improvements on the technologies that you're using, particularly if they're open source, actually making those available to the creators, or just generally speaking to the broader public, so that we can all help each other, and particularly, I guess, help in that research phase of knowing what issues people have come across when using the different frameworks, so that we can better understand what I guess what the impact of choosing a technology such as that is. I think the other thing I've learned is, tapping into the accessibility community if you get stuck. I've had so much, help from different people in the accessibility community, reaching out, whether it be within Australia or, more broadly around the world. And I think we're all learning in this space. And so, there's a lot of really clever people out there, much more clever than I am in this space. And I think you should you tap into them. So I guess to sum up, what we learned is that you really want to set yourself up for success by researching and planning, setting expectations, defining roles and responsibilities, and of course making sure accessibility is embedded into the entire life cycle, not addressed at the end if at all possible, because that's going to increase the cost of remediation. And there's a whole host of other issues, as I mentioned, for my project that came up that just added to time and added to the difficulty of actually repairing accessibility. Don't focus on WCAG to the exclusion of inclusive design. I think if you've got a project or an organisation that is embracing inclusive design, WCAG has a place, and it's a very important place. I'm one of the few people who actually likes to read through WCAG and crawl through it and test against it and that kind of thing. But at the same time, that can't be to the exclusion of inclusive design processes, doing user research, and also focusing on, for me, that delightful experience that I feel everyone should be able to experience. Know that probably screen reader support for ARIA is going to make you pull your hair out. I think that's just a given. But the need for usability testing is super important, and really I think is only going to increase the more complex your app is. With a simple app, you can probably apply accessibility best practice, usability best practice, and get most of the way there. But I think in this complex app space, you just can't rely on that. It's, you know, it's too risky, to be honest, and it's not going to get you what you want. And then lastly, document any decisions or issues, and also, you know, feedback to the community, and tap into the community as well. So on that note, I'd like you to wish you a happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And on my screen, I'm sharing with you a little fellow who we dreamed up for our last accessibility camp last year. And he's a knight. He's got his a knight's helmet on, a big sword, a shield with a whole lot of little access symbols of braille and sign language and closed captions and hearing and vision and wheelchair sign. And he's our Accessibility Avenger. And I think today, on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, we are all Accessibility Avengers. And when we all work together, we can make this world more inclusive. Thank you.
Awesome. Good stuff.
Yeah. Very good.
Let me steal that back from you. Okay, we actually did have a couple of questions from Twitter.
Nice. Hang on.
Yeah,
let's sharing my screen. There we go.
Okay, the first question. They want to know what version of Angular was used for the eCommerce example.
That's a good question. Because it wasn't my project, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but if we can share the Twitter link or whoever it is, I will definitely come back to you on that. No
problem with that. And someone else commented, I think someone replied already, but they wanted to know, they quoted your web devs ride into town sprinkling in ARIA and leave consequences to others. They said, ouch, true, but what are those consequences?
I think, look, it really depends on what's being done and what's being misrepresented. So sometimes it has minimal impact to the user, particularly if it is one of the more relationship-driven, you know, ARIA owns that kind of thing attributes. When you start to get areas where there's, you know, wrong roles, you know, wrong states, that kind of thing, then I think it gets much more, it has much more of an impact on the user. So they're sort of the categories that I think things fall into.
All right. Well, I think we're good. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. Tonight for us, this afternoon. That was a lot of fun. We hope you had fun. And
I did. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Okay. Well, now you can rush out and enjoy the rest of your Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Thank you. We will.
All right. Have a good one. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks. See you later.